Good Friday morning, everybody. Hope everybody's having a great day and staying warm. At least where Doug and I are at. It's that's been difficult to do the last 3 or 4 days, Doug. So,
Yeah,
you
you just you wish you'd have the windshields that stay clean and the rear view mirror that you can actually see out of, or the rear view window you can see out of.
For our part of the country, we had a heck of a winter storm. For people up north, they call this every day. So they always laugh at us from down in this part of the world. My friends up north, I talked to them and they're like, well, I said, man, yeah, we're snowed in. And they're like, well, really? What? I said, yeah, we got like 6 inches of snow. And they literally start giggling. So it's different down here. But for us, this was a major winter storm that hit us. So we've been shut down pretty much the last couple, 3 days.
Yeah, quick story on that. I had a school district I did some training in northern Wisconsin in January. And we were talking about the wind, and the wind chill factor was like minus 20. And I said, that's something you have to think about in the sense of your school safety plans. It's why we sometimes cancel school, because if you ever had a fire drill or something where kids, had to leave the building and they weren't prepared for it, you could have some serious problems. And he said, minus 20, he said, that's a regular day up here. He was just basically saying that they just pretty much can't not come to school if the wind chill was that high. And he said, nope, we're prepared for that. We practice that sort of stuff and stuff like that.
So really different animal.
Yep.
Well, we always every week we sit down and we look and say, okay, what do we want to talk about? We want to try to talk about relevant and current issues. Unfortunately, this week we get to talk about a couple more shootings, unfortunately, that occurred this week. So, Doug, you want to walk us through those scenarios?
Yeah, so there's Richfield, Minnesota had a shooting outside of, I think, the South Education Center. That was a fight that had occurred, and we'll talk about some of the dynamics of this, but this was a fight that had occurred, and it's something that had been boiling up or boiling over, I guess, a reoccurring incident. Happened outside. Unfortunately, somebody pulled out a gun. 2 people were shot. I believe I heard a 19-year-old was minorly wounded, and they don't know if that was from the fight or the gunshot, but a 15-year-old lost his life and a 17-year-old was in critical condition. And then we also had an incident at I think it was Bridgefield, Virginia, a small school there, where 2 campus police officers or campus security personnel were investigating a person that was in a building that they shouldn't have been. And it seems to me like just they were basically ambushed. They were talking with the person, and the next thing you know, it erupted in gunfire, and both of those security personnel lost their life. That suspect has been taken in custody. Actually, all suspects in both of these incidents have been identified and taken in custody. And but those are both issues that bring up some salient points for us as we talk about school safety, campus safety, and this sort of layered protection approach.
Yeah, I think it's just I know some people that I communicated with that have joined in and have talked to me about some of our conversations in the past, just friends and folks like that will ask questions, and they say, well, geez, you guys sure talk about it. The key is to have a system, that notification system that's quick. Well, this is a great example of why that's so important, right?
Yeah, so I want to quote this WCCO, this CBS Minnesota, just a short little paragraph they had, but there's two really salient points that come out of this article. But after the shooting, South Education Center immediately went into lockdown, as did nearby schools. Officials at Richfield Middle School, which is located about a block away from South Education Center, posted on Facebook that some officers mistakenly responded to their school. The officers were wearing bulletproof vests and had their weapons drawn. And the reason that I bring that up is this is so typical of what keeps happening in this situation, is because we are trying to relay this information from people in personal crisis that are under threat, and they're on 911 calls trying to tell the dispatcher what's going on. And I keep going back to it, but we would never expect people to do this in a fire situation. In a fire, you pull the fire alarm. It immediately tells fire department exactly where in the building where they're needed. No information has to call. Nobody ever hears a fire alarm and thinks that, hey, I have to call 911. But more importantly is that everybody in a building is notified they're under threat because of a fire, so that the alarms go off. We have to have those same systems in our schools. If something happens either on the perimeter of the school or in the inside of that building, we need everybody to know exactly where in the building there's a threat, where there's danger. We need everybody in the building alerted that there is a threat, and we need law enforcement to know exactly where they're supposed to go. That's the type of stuff that SafeDefend does. But when we look at what happened in Richfield, we see that didn't happen. The immediate lockdown was good, but when I talked to a friend of mine who knows some people up in Minnesota, he did some reach out for me. And this is all off record. I mean, it's not like it's for, but he said basically it was all done through word of mouth, PA systems, and numerous 911 calls. And I'm like, that's so inefficient, because if you're sitting there on 911, you're not notifying building occupants through a PA, and you're not getting your classroom on lockdown. It takes too long. And every time we get an incident like this, it just demonstrates this continues to fail for obvious reasons.
You know, we were on a call, you and I were yesterday for an hour and a half, 2 hours, talking about a variety of things, but you know, there's always a wish list, right? SafeDefend has a wish list of things that they want to do product wise to improve. There's all these, and my point of bringing this up is it's ever changing, but there's one common thing. You got to have quick notification. That never changes. It doesn't matter what technology SafeDefend looks to add. Doesn't matter, you know, what the gadgets are or what. It's still, you've got to get that immediate notification to the good guys so they can come help with the bad guys.
Right. But if half of them are going to the wrong location,
right,
it could be catastrophic. I mean, in these situations, we literally, it's called the universal approach, where literally every law enforcement officer within that community is heading to that direct location. And so what you want is a situation where they flood that school, make sure it's safe, neutralize any threat. If half of them are at the wrong location, that can't happen. And so that's why it's good communication, clear communication. And when we look at these sort of things, when we look at these layered approaches, everybody focuses on cameras and access controls and school resource officers. And those are good layers. But one of the things you have to understand is that those are the layers that have always failed. From all the way back from when I was back in 1983, when my school district had a school shooting, and that was the layers they put in, and nothing changed. It's still a situation like that. And so what you have to understand is the number one priority, and we know it from fire, the number one priority is notification and communication. You have to notify you're under threat and communicate to them where the threat is. And that's what you've got to do first. If you haven't put that as a priority, you're failing your students, your staff, everybody, the community is not being properly supported because they don't have the information they need in a crisis.
Yeah, and I think it's just so crazy that we're sitting here in 2022 now and we're still having these conversations. I mean, I think, you know, these shootings, unfortunately, you talked about, you know, yours in 1983, and you know, I live in a community where the term going postal, unfortunately, was created because the community just south of me a few miles, but it's a community where our office sets, and we're about a mile from that postal location. And, you know, this has been going on forever, forever. I think we hear about it more now. But we unfortunately have had these kind of things going on. I think there's a false sense that this just started happening.
Yeah, there's no doubt that, yes, people have always felt that, like, one of the first things you always hear is, I never thought it would happen here. And this has happened
every time.
This has happened in the middle of West Liberty, Salem, Ohio. They had, I think it was 400 students, K through 12, in one building. Right. That the smallest type of school community you can imagine, they had a school shooting down to Parkland, where you have the 5th largest school district in the country. And we've had these happen at LA and New York, which are the 2 largest. And this is pervasive in our society. And you say, well, let's do something about the guns and let's do something about that. And I say, great, I'm all in support of that. But understand, there's just no one thing that's going to fix it. And that kind of brings us down to what we were talking about here with the whole Bridgefield, Virginia campus shooting. Is you had it's a small community, you had 2 community security officers, and they were both neutralized immediately. And if, but for the grace of God, if that shooter had decided to go back onto campus or remain on campus or stay in that building and start harming people, there's nobody there to protect them. And so that's the same type of thing that we've got to get people to start to understand is, law enforcement being on campus is only a layer of security. It is not the answer to your security problems. You still need to make sure that if something happens, that information can get out to all the students and staff that they need to go in lockdown, and that other help can be notified immediately so that they can get back up to help those 2 officers out.
So this is something that just popped in my head. What would you tell people as an expert in this area, in those communities, once they've had an active shooter situation, how do they move forward? What do they do now? I mean, because there's, I would assume there's going to be this automatic desire, this immediate reaction says, oh gosh, we got to make sure this never happens again. And then do people get lulled back to sleep? Has that been your experience, or do people tend to take action, unfortunately, after the fact?
Well, what ends up happening is, and we saw this, and we've seen this in numerous places. And I don't want to point out necessarily specific communities, but I can tell you, I've gone in, I've talked to them. What ends up happening is they have the federal approach. Usually, there's lots of money that comes in from the state and stuff like that. And so then the federal approach is, if you think of any federal courthouse or any federal building that you know of, it's massive security. They put down, all the doors are locked, and they have officers and metal detectors and all this sort of stuff. And now all of a sudden, it's like extreme control. When they try and do that, but the problem is that you cannot maintain that unless you just have unlimited resources like the federal government. So high schools cannot be locked down and turned into these fortresses that we want. So what we need to understand is you're not going to be able to lock down, the student parking lot and the bus area and then the front door. And then you're not going to be able to do it from 6 a.m. till 10 at night. My son went to saw the Grease at his high school last night, and I picked him up at 9:30 right out front of the doors. And so, these buildings are porous. And so you have to sit there and say, what do we need there? And what we need is, again, to make sure that if something happens in that building, everybody can get notified, but that people know they've had the training that says, okay, where do I go? How do I survive this? How do I lock down? What are my options? And so those are the things that communities need to do. What they look to do is do the physical security, the camera systems, the access control, and then they say, let's get a police officer. But I can tell you right now, I dropped my son off. He and his girlfriend, his date, they went to this play. I dropped them off at 6:45 at night, and I dropped them and picked them up at 9:30. There was no police officer in sight. There was no police officer in the building that night. Something can happen at that same time, but who was there was staff. There were custodians. There were the directors, the staff that deal with the drama people. They were there, right, and they would have been able to activate some sort of system or put out the alarm. But that's where we're at as a society. The other thing that they do is that once they've come up with their solutions, they tend to just wash their hands of it. We've solved that, right? We spent $1 million. We upgraded the schools. We're good.
Done.
We're done.
Yeah, that's done.
We're done. So what's next? We need new AstroTurf. We need this. We need to refinish the floors. Whatever you got to do. They just move on. Once they've thrown some money at it, they move on. And you have to understand, it is a constant. You need to make sure that every year you have training for your teachers, that they understand that. You need to constantly be reviewing your policies, make sure that you're enforcing those policies and keeping them safe. When we look at this Minnesota shooting, it's very difficult because it happened outside. It was something that occurred beyond the scope of, like, say, the building, since it was out there on the sidewalk. But it is one of the things where, how much did the school know that these 5 kids were having, issues, and how much did they move forward to say, hey, what's going on? How do we resolve this? Okay, let's make sure that, whatever's happening gets resolved, that they don't boil up to the point that they turn into these fights. And that's some of the stuff that we have to start to make sure we do. And that is ongoing. You can never make that go away. Every year, you're going to have to checking in with these kids, finding out if they've had any future issues or further issues with these kids, with their fighting. Hey, whatever happened with that situation, it requires someone to follow up on these sort of things. And that's manpower. And so that's something else that's issue that communities don't do, is always the follow-up they need to make sure that these incidents don't boil up and turn into violent events.
Well, and that's training, right? I mean, we've got to, I think, we always talk about the system, and obviously we want people to protect their staffs and their children and their employees if they're a private business. But at the end of the day, you got to train to it. You've got to train to those scenarios, whether it's proper training to educators, building site administrators, on how to do just that. How do you follow up, make sure to try to prevent that from happening? I know, being married to a career educator, I've had a front row seat, as a spouse to a lot of different things over the years. And it's been interesting to me, but it seems like it's apathy where, they're just boys are boys, or, that's how junior high kids are, they're a little mean, they're in that stage in their life. And it's dangerous. You've got to be proactive, because you don't know what else is going on in that young person's life. If it happens to be a young person, you don't know what's going on. And same thing with personnel inside the building, or a disgruntled disgruntled parent shows up, or whatever the case may be. You got to pay attention, and you got to engage.
There's that old adage of no news is good news, and that's no longer really applicable. Just because you haven't heard anything isn't bubbling up doesn't mean that it isn't festering there. One of the things I counsel some administrators on is that if you ever get a situation where somebody's going through, say, a difficult breakup or a divorce or something like that, you need to just set in a note in your computer or a calendar event that reminds you, hey, follow up with this person. Make sure that nothing's going on. Make sure that there aren't some contentious custody issues. Make sure that they didn't stop paying child support. All these sort of things might happen that you just wouldn't even be aware of. You were aware of the initial situation, but it goes on. But the same thing with employees. I always say you've got to give grace, right? When an employee messes up, let's say that they're tardy and you had to write them up for, say, being late, and they had a personal issue, but they just hadn't shared it with you. And so the documentation has to be done there because they had been late five times in the month. If all of a sudden 2 months later they have no incidences of it, you need to take it an effort. Don't call them to your office. Go to their classroom. Go to their place. Find them. You track them down so they don't have that anxiety of coming to your office. You find them down and say, hey, I just want you to know that I noticed you've done much better in improvement, and I really think this is good, and I really enjoy having you here, and I'm glad that this happened. And I just want you to know that if anything ever boils up again, that's a personal issue, please let me know so that we can work something out. We don't get there again. But you have to give them that grace and that sort of just support that tells them, hey, I do know that these things happen. And that's what will alleviate those concerns. And that's and the same thing goes with kids. If they're in a contentious situation with somebody, if they get disciplined for fighting or whatever, make sure you tell them, hey, I haven't heard anything. I've heard some great things, and I just want you to know that you're doing well. And those are the type of things we don't do. So when you say, what do schools do in the aftermath of these shootings, is they don't change the underlying issues of how do we prevent that. Now, at the same time, we still need to make sure that if it does happen, again, you have the notification, you have the layers there or whatever, but there's a lot of sort of intervention steps that can be taken to prevent these things from boiling up to the point that a fist fight out front of school turns into a shooting and a 15-year-old losing his life.
Yeah, being proactive in anything involving human beings is extremely important, and how you approach it. And again, on those issues, I just encourage everybody to reach out to Doug, info at SafeDefend. They've got a variety of training programs that can really help your staffs and really put them and the students in a situation to have a great outcome in situations. So, Doug, I'm going to give you the last few words on this before we wrap it up today. We're closing in on the end of our episode this week, but give them one or two pearls. What should they do today to make these kiddos or these employees safer?
Well, the one thing that, when we go back to this campus shooting in Virginia, understand that you have to always be thinking in layers, and what if one layer fails? And so that's the thing that is so important and so critical for these situations, is we keep seeing situations like that where unfortunately 2 people lost their lives. Obviously the memories of those 2 will be what brings us all through our time of mourning, because they were great friends, and there's some great articles about what they did together. But what I want people to understand is, just because you have one layer in place doesn't necessarily mean that you can look the other way and feel that this situation is resolved. People have bypassed access controls. Cameras don't stop violence. And then school resource officers, they're not ubiquitous, and they can't be everywhere, and they aren't always there. So make sure that if anything happens, you have options outside of just say, we've got a school resource officer, because they're only there 8 hours a day, Monday through Friday. And so those are the type of things that we have to think about, is what are our priorities? In all of these situations, you just have to look at the fire alarm and understand communication and information is the priority. So if you don't notify your people immediately, that should be your priority.
Well, Doug, as always, we appreciate you. We appreciate you sharing your insight and your expertise, and wish you a happy weekend. It's supposed to be in the 50s and 60s first of next week, so we'll get rid of this white stuff maybe.
And good. Hey, the good thing is that I got a south-facing house, so my driveway was shoveled, and the sun took care of the rest of it. I got my nice, clean driveway, so I'm happy.
Well, your kids are happy too, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, they don't get up early enough with me to do that shovel.
Yeah. That's how it works. All right, Doug. We appreciate you, brother. We invite everybody to join us every Friday, 9:30 Central Time, to learn more about how you can make your workplace safer and just a more enjoyable overall experience. Thanks again for joining us. Doug, we'll see you later.
Have a great weekend.
Take care.